The use of data in criminal justice shouldn't be controversial in the sense that we should all want more information before we make decisions. It's the more information, the better. And it can help in a variety of ways. So, for example, if you were trying to decide, how should we characterize a burglary for purposes of sentencing, you could guess, and people do guess, or you could actually look at all of the burglaries that have been committed and find that overwhelmingly there's no violence involved at all. In fact, most people who burglarize try to find unoccupied structures. They'd rather not get caught. And so there is no violence involved. And so if you know that, then you could say to yourself, okay, as a general category, I'm going to treat burglary by viewing it as not a violent crime. If I have particular instances where it's violent, then sentences could be increased on that basis. But generally, categorically, it really should be viewed in this nonviolent way. Data can help you figure out, does pretrial detention help deter crime, or does it in fact exacerbate crime because people lose social connections, jobs? When we look at the data, we find in fact it leads to higher crime precisely because people lose those connections. So data is always valuable. I think it gets controversial based on what people want to use data for. And in particular, I think there is a concern when people want to use data to make predictions. There is some controversy over using data, for example, as part of risk instruments to try to figure out what's the risk that someone is going to commit a crime in the future. Even there, when you're using data to predict, though, I think we could have a debate about when, if at all, we should ever try to make predictions. But once we have decided that we are supposed to predict something, for example, in most jurisdictions, deciding whether or not to detain somebody pre-trial, you are making a prediction. Will they come back to court, or will they commit another crime if the judge lets them go? And when you're making that decision, it doesn't make any sense to me not to use whatever data we have about that, because otherwise the judge or the prosecutor, they're just going to use their own intuitive guess. And so the question is really, would that decision maker be better off with some information using data or not? And I think, it's always better to use it. We can definitely question what kind of data is relevant. We certainly wouldn't want the kind of data that is discriminatory. You don't need to ask where someone lives or their education or their employment. We could look at other things about them and get a predictive tool. For example, a tool that looks at their age and criminal history. You don't need any of those other things. They're just as predictive. They're not perfect. If you look at criminal history, it's going to have racial bias built in because of policing. But if you don't use the tool, the question is always as compared to what? And the as compared to what would be the judge or prosecutor just making their own guess. And, that's discriminatory too. We know that. We have studies that show that judges make discriminatory decisions on the basis of race in bail determinations. And so data and tools could make that better. Will it make it perfect? No. But it's always better to have the information.